I thought my brother-in-law Kevin was just passionate about food. Turns out, he was passionate about something else entirely. And when I discovered what was really happening in his kitchen, I didn't just stop eating his cooking. I made sure the authorities knew exactly what kind of chef he really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm a 26-year-old marketing coordinator living in Denver, Colorado. I work for a small tech startup downtown, spend my weekends hiking the trails around Boulder, and until recently, I thought I had a pretty good handle on what normal family dynamics looked like. I should probably mention that I'm the younger sister in our family, which has always meant I'm the one who's supposed to go along with things, keep the peace, and not rock the boat too much. Growing up, my older sister Melissa was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the practical one who just made things work without much fanfare. When Melissa married Kevin 4 years ago, I was genuinely happy for her. She'd always been drawn to creative types, and Kevin seemed to fit the bill perfectly. He was an aspiring chef, or at least that's how he introduced himself at family gatherings. He had this confident way of talking about food that made you think he really knew what he was doing. He'd describe flavor profiles and cooking techniques with the kind of authority that made everyone nod along, even when half of what he said went over our heads. Kevin and Melissa live in a beautiful townhouse in Highlands Ranch, about 30 minutes south of where I have my apartment in Capitol Hill. Their place always smelled like something was cooking, and Kevin had transformed their kitchen into what looked like a professional workspace. Stainless steel appliances, knife blocks with German blades, copper pots hanging from a rack above the island, and shelves lined with spices I'd never heard of. Everything looked expensive and impressive, the kind of setup you'd see in a cooking magazine. Sunday dinners became a tradition shortly after they got married. Kevin would spend the entire day preparing elaborate meals while Melissa handled the table settings and wine pairings. Our parents would drive over from Lakewood. Sometimes our cousin Danny would join us, and we'd all gather around their dining room table for what Kevin called his weekly masterpiece presentations. He'd describe each dish as he served it, explaining the inspiration behind the flavors and the techniques he'd use to achieve specific textures or tastes. I have to admit, I was impressed at first. Here was someone who seemed to have found his calling, who talked about food with genuine enthusiasm and had clearly invested serious money in creating the perfect cooking environment. Kevin would mention trips to specialty grocery stores, how he'd tracked down particular ingredients from specific farms, or the way he'd modified traditional recipes to create his own signature versions. He made cooking sound like both an art and a science, and he seemed to approach it with the kind of dedication that successful chefs are known for. The thing is, I've always been someone who pays attention to details. It's part of what makes me good at my job in marketing, where you have to notice the small things that don't quite add up, the inconsistencies in data that might indicate a bigger problem. And over those first few months of Sunday dinners, I started noticing things about Kevin's cooking that didn't match his confident presentations. The first thing I noticed was how little Kevin actually ate of his own food. He'd serve everyone, generous portions, and then take tiny amounts for himself, claiming he'd been tasting throughout the cooking process, and wasn't that hungry. At first, this seemed reasonable. Professional chefs probably do taste their food constantly while preparing it, but it happened every single week, without exception, and I started to wonder if there was another reason Kevin wasn't eating much of what he'd spent all day preparing. Then there were the reactions around the table. Our dad has never been one to hide his opinions about food. He's the kind of person who will loudly declare when something is delicious and equally loudly complain when it's not. But at Kevin's dinners, Dad would eat slowly, making polite conversation about work or sports while barely commenting on the meal. Our mom, who usually asks for recipes when she enjoys something, would smile and nod, but never request Kevin's instructions for recreating any of his dishes at home. Melissa seemed oblivious to these subtle signs. Or maybe she was choosing to ignore them. She'd gush about Kevin's talents, describing him to friends as a natural chef who was just waiting for the right opportunity to open his own restaurant. She'd post photos of his dishes on social media with captions about feeling lucky to have her own personal chef. Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, but I started to wonder if she was trying to convince herself as much as everyone else. The flavors themselves were what really got my attention, though. Kevin's food always tasted off in ways I couldn't quite identify. His pasta sauces had strange, metallic undertones that lingered in your mouth long after the meal. His chicken dishes had textures that seemed wrong, sometimes rubbery and other times oddly mushy, never quite achieving that perfect tenderness you'd expect from someone who claimed to have studied cooking techniques extensively. His vegetables were either completely raw or cooked to the point where they'd lost all structure, with no middle ground that suggested any understanding of proper timing. I kept these observations to myself for a long time. Melissa was happy. Kevin was clearly passionate about what he was doing, and maybe I was just being overly critical. After all, cooking is subjective, and just because his food didn't appeal to my particular tastes didn't mean there was anything actually wrong with it. I figured maybe Kevin was just experimental in ways that didn't match my more traditional preferences. But then came my birthday last month. I was turning 27, and Kevin announced that he wanted to prepare my favorite meal as a special celebration. I'd mentioned months earlier that I loved chicken parmesan, the kind of comfort food that reminds you of family dinners and cozy nights at home. Kevin latched onto this information and declared that he was going to prepare an authentic version that would put any restaurant to shame. He spent weeks talking about his plans for this birthday dinner. He described how he was going to make his own marinara sauce from San Marzano tomatoes, how he'd found a specialty shop that imported real Parmigiano Reggiano directly from Italy, and how he planned to bread the chicken using a technique he'd learned from watching videos of Italian chefs. The way he talked about it made it sound like he was preparing for a culinary competition rather than a family birthday dinner. I should have been flattered by the attention and effort Kevin was putting into this meal. Instead, I found myself feeling increasingly anxious as the date approached. Something about his enthusiasm felt forced, like he was trying too hard to prove something that should have been obvious if he really had the skills he claimed to possess. Professional chefs don't usually need to spend weeks describing how they're going to prepare a relatively straightforward dish, and they certainly don't feel the need to justify every ingredient choice with detailed explanations about authenticity and technique. The week before my birthday, I made a decision that felt slightly invasive but necessary for my peace of mind. I decided to do some research into Kevin's background, just to satisfy my curiosity about where he'd developed his cooking skills. Melissa had always been vague about the details of Kevin's culinary training, mentioning that he'd worked in restaurant kitchens during college, but never providing specifics about which restaurants or what kind of experience he'd gained. I started with simple internet searches, looking for any mention of Kevin Patterson in connection with Denver area restaurants or culinary schools. I checked the websites of every cooking school in Colorado, looked through alumni directories, where they were available, and searched for his name in local restaurant reviews or food blogs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I found was absolutely nothing. No mention of Kevin Patterson in any culinary context, no evidence that he'd ever worked in a professional kitchen, no indication that he'd received any formal training in cooking or food safety. This absence of information was more telling than I'd expected. In today's world, where everything leaves some kind of digital footprint, the complete lack of any professional cooking background was significant. If Kevin had really worked in restaurant kitchens or attended culinary school, there would be some trace of it online. Former co-workers would have social media connections, cooking schools would have graduation records, local food writers would have mentioned promising young chefs in their articles. I expanded my search to include food safety certifications, which are required for anyone working in commercial kitchens in Colorado. The state maintains searchable databases of certified food handlers, and Kevin's name didn't appear in any of them. This was particularly concerning because food safety training is not optional for restaurant workers. It's a legal requirement that's taken seriously by health departments and restaurant owners alike. My research also led me to explore Kevin's social media presence more carefully than I'd done before. His Instagram account was filled with photos of elaborate dishes and cooking processes. But when I looked closely at the images, I started noticing inconsistencies. Many of the photos appeared to be taken in different kitchens, with different equipment and lighting than what I knew Kevin had in his home. Some of the dishes were photographed against backgrounds that didn't match Melissa and Kevin's dining room or kitchen spaces. More troubling were the timestamps on some of the photos. Kevin would post images of complex dishes that supposedly took hours to prepare, but the metadata showed they'd been posted within minutes of each other. This suggested that either Kevin was incredibly fast at cooking multiple elaborate meals simultaneously, or he was posting photos that weren't actually of his own cooking. The final piece of my research involved reaching out to some mutual friends who had attended Kevin and Melissa's dinner parties before our family Sunday dinners became a regular tradition. I framed my questions casually, asking about their favorite dishes from those early gatherings. What I learned was illuminating. Several people mentioned getting sick after eating at Kevin's house, with symptoms that sounded suspiciously like mild food poisoning. Others admitted they'd started eating before arriving at dinner parties because Kevin's food was an acquired taste that they hadn't quite acquired yet. One friend, Sarah, was particularly honest about her experiences. She told me that she'd attended 3 dinner parties at Kevin and Melissa's house during their first year of marriage, and each time she'd left feeling nauseous and uncomfortable. After the 3rd incident, she'd started declining their invitations, making excuses about scheduling conflicts rather than hurt their feelings by admitting the truth about Kevin's cooking. Armed with this information, I began to see our Sunday family dinners in a new light. The polite but unenthusiastic responses from our parents, the way people seemed to eat slowly and drink more wine than usual, the fact that everyone always claimed to be satisfied with small portions. These weren't signs of sophisticated palates appreciating complex flavors. They were signs of people trying to be polite while consuming food that didn't taste right, possibly food that wasn't safe to eat. I also started paying closer attention to Kevin's behavior during our Sunday dinners. I noticed that he rarely ate the proteins he prepared, focusing instead on the side dishes and salads. When he did eat meat or fish, he'd cut it into very small pieces and chew each bite thoroughly, as if he was checking for problems with texture or flavor. This wasn't the behavior of a confident chef enjoying his own creations. This was the behavior of someone who wasn't entirely sure his food was properly prepared. The more I observed and researched, the more convinced I became that Kevin was not the experienced chef he claimed to be. At best, he was an enthusiastic amateur who'd gotten in over his head trying to impress people with skills he didn't actually possess. At worst, he was someone who was regularly serving potentially unsafe food to our family without any understanding of proper cooking techniques or food safety protocols. This realization filled me with a mixture of anger and concern. Anger because Kevin had been misrepresenting himself for years, allowing our family to believe he was knowledgeable about cooking when he clearly wasn't. Concern because if my suspicions were correct, he'd been putting people's health at risk with his inexperience and lack of proper food safety training. As my birthday dinner approached, I found myself dreading what should have been a celebration. Kevin's enthusiasm about preparing my favorite meal now seemed less like generous hospitality and more like a dangerous experiment being conducted on people I cared about. I knew I needed to do something, but I wasn't sure what approach would be most effective in protecting our family, while also avoiding the kind of confrontation that might damage relationships permanently. The stage was set for what would become the most uncomfortable birthday dinner of my life, and the beginning of a family crisis that would force everyone to confront truths they'd been avoiding for years. The morning of my birthday arrived with Kevin's excited text message at 7 a.m. He'd sent a photo of what appeared to be a whole chicken sitting on his counter. accompanied by a message that read, "Today's the day. Your birthday chicken parm is going to be legendary. I've got everything I need for the perfect Italian experience." Something about the photo bothered me, though I couldn't immediately identify what it was. The chicken looked pale and slightly gray around the edges, not the fresh pink color you'd expect from quality poultry. I was getting ready for work when my phone rang. It was Melissa calling from what sounded like her car based on the background, noise and echo in her voice. Her tone had that slightly forced cheerfulness she used when she was trying to convince herself of something as much as convince whoever she was talking to. "Rachel, I just wanted to make sure you're as excited as Kevin is about tonight," she said, though there was something in her voice that suggested she might be trying to gauge my actual level of enthusiasm. "He's been planning this for weeks, you know. He even went to that specialty Italian market in Cherry Creek to get authentic ingredients, the one where everything costs twice as much as the regular grocery store." I paused in applying my mascara, struck by something odd about what she'd just said. Kevin had been talking for weeks about using San Marzano tomatoes and imported Parmigiano Reggiano, but if he'd just gone shopping yesterday for a dinner he was cooking today, that meant he'd been planning a meal using ingredients he hadn't actually purchased until the last minute. Professional chefs, or even serious home cooks, don't typically wait until the day of preparation to buy their ingredients, especially for something they've been discussing as extensively as Kevin had been discussing. "My birthday dinner. That's really thoughtful of him," I replied carefully, not wanting to dampen Melissa's obvious excitement, but also not wanting to fake enthusiasm I didn't feel. "Did he say what time he wants everyone to arrive?" 6:30 for appetizers. Dinner at 7:30, Melissa said. "He's making some kind of antipasto spread to start, then the chicken parm with homemade pasta and garlic bread. Oh, and he's attempting tiramisu for dessert, though he warned me it might not set properly since he's never made it before." This last detail sent another small alarm bell ringing in my mind. Kevin regularly presented himself as someone with extensive cooking experience, someone who'd worked in professional kitchens and studied traditional techniques. But he was planning to serve a dessert he'd never attempted before at what was supposed to be a special birthday dinner. It was another small inconsistency that didn't quite fit with the image he'd cultivated of himself as a skilled and experienced chef. "Sounds ambitious," I said, which was true enough without being either enthusiastic or critical. "You know Kevin." Melissa laughed, though it sounded a bit strained. "He doesn't believe in doing anything halfway. Sometimes I think he gets a little carried away with wanting to impress people, but his heart is definitely in the right place." After we hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that Melissa's comment about Kevin getting carried away was more significant than she'd intended it to be. It suggested that even she had some awareness that his ambitions might sometimes exceed his actual abilities, though she seemed determined to frame this as an endearing character trait rather than a potential problem. At work that day, I found myself distracted and unable to focus on the marketing campaign analysis I was supposed to be completing. During my lunch break, I decided to drive to the Italian market in Cherry Creek that Melissa had mentioned, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I wanted to see if I could learn anything more about Kevin's shopping habits or level of knowledge about the ingredients he claimed to be using. The market was smaller than I'd expected, with narrow aisles packed with imported goods and specialty items that did indeed cost significantly more than what you'd find at a regular supermarket. I wandered through the store, looking at the selection of tomatoes, cheeses, and other ingredients that Kevin might have purchased for the evening's meal. When I approached the cheese counter, the older Italian man working behind it greeted me with a warm smile and asked if I needed help finding anything specific. On impulse, I decided to ask him about Parmigiano Reggiano, curious to see if Kevin had made an impression during his shopping trip the previous day. "I'm wondering about the quality of your Parmigiano Reggiano," I said. "My brother-in-law was here yesterday buying some for a special dinner, and he's very particular about authenticity." The man's expression became slightly puzzled. "Yesterday? I don't think we sold any Parmigiano Reggiano yesterday." We've been out of the good stuff for almost a week now, waiting for a new shipment from our supplier in Italy. I felt my stomach drop slightly. Are you sure? He would have been a tall guy, brown hair, probably talking a lot about traditional Italian cooking techniques. No, I'm certain, the man replied. I'm here every day and yesterday was pretty slow. Only sold a few small items. No cheese at all, actually. When are you planning to use it? The new shipment should arrive Friday. I thanked him and left the store, my mind racing. Kevin had either lied to Melissa about shopping at this market, or he'd purchased cheese somewhere else and misled her about its authenticity. Either way, it was another piece of evidence that Kevin wasn't being entirely truthful about his ingredients or his preparation methods. Back at my apartment that evening, I stood in front of my closet trying to decide what to wear to a dinner I was increasingly dreading. My phone buzzed with another text from Kevin, this one showing a photo of what appeared to be pasta dough with the caption, "Homemade fettuccine in progress. This is going to be incredible." The pasta in the photo looked oddly gray and lumpy, not the smooth golden color that properly made pasta should have. I chose a simple black dress and cardigan, something that would be appropriate for a birthday dinner, but could also be quickly changed out of if the evening went badly and I needed to leave early. As I was putting on my jewelry, I found myself thinking about all the small inconsistencies I'd noticed over the past few weeks, and how they seemed to be adding up to a pattern of deception that was much more extensive than I'd initially realized. The drive to Melissa and Kevin's house took me through some of the prettier neighborhoods in the Denver suburbs, past houses with manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. Their townhouse fit right into this environment, with its modern architecture and carefully maintained landscaping, suggesting the kind of lifestyle that required substantial income to maintain. I'd always assumed that Kevin's claimed restaurant experience had led to some kind of well-paying food industry job, but now I was beginning to wonder how he and Melissa were actually financing their lifestyle. I arrived at exactly 6:30, carrying a bottle of wine I'd picked up on my way over. The wine was a mid-range Chianti that I'd chosen specifically because it was the kind of thing that would pair well with Italian food if Kevin's cooking turned out to be edible, but wouldn't be a huge loss if the evening turned into a disaster. Kevin answered the door wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cook," and had what appeared to be flower handprints all over the front of his shirt. His hair was disheveled and there was a slight sheen of sweat on his forehead, giving him the appearance of someone who'd been working very hard in a hot kitchen for several hours. "The birthday girl," he announced with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, though there was something slightly manic about his energy. "Perfect timing. I've got appetizers ready and the main course is just about finished. This is going to be a meal you'll never forget." He was right about that, though not in the way he intended. The living room where our family typically gathered for pre-dinner drinks looked normal enough, with soft lighting and music playing quietly in the background. Our parents were already there, sitting on the couch with glasses of wine and making small talk with Melissa. Dad looked relaxed in his weekend casual clothes, while Mom was wearing one of her nicer blouses and had obviously made an effort to dress up for the occasion. "Happy birthday, sweetie," Mom said, getting up to give me a hug. "Kevin's been working in that kitchen all afternoon. We've been hearing all kinds of interesting sounds coming from in there." "Interesting sounds?" I asked, though I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know what she meant. "Lots of banging and clattering," Dad chimed in, "and some language that probably shouldn't be repeated in polite company. Whatever he's making, it's certainly requiring a lot of effort." Melissa appeared from the kitchen carrying a platter of what Kevin had described as antipasto, but looked more like a random assortment of items arranged on a plate without much thought or artistry. There were some crackers, a few slices of what appeared to be grocery store salami, some olives that looked like they'd come straight from a jar, and several chunks of cheese that definitely was not the Parmigiano Reggiano Kevin had claimed to purchase from the Italian market. "Kevin wanted to bring this out himself, but he's dealing with a minor situation in the kitchen," Melissa said, setting the platter down on the coffee table. "Something about the pasta not cooperating the way he expected." I took a piece of cheese and immediately noticed that it had an odd texture, slightly rubbery and lacking the sharp, complex flavor that good Parmigiano Reggiano should have. It tasted more like the generic Parmesan you could buy pre-grated at any supermarket, the kind that comes in a plastic container and bears only a passing resemblance to actual Italian cheese. "This is delicious," Mom said politely, though I noticed she took very small bites and chased each one with a generous sip of wine. From the kitchen came the sound of something metallic clattering to the floor, followed by Kevin's voice saying something that was definitely not appropriate for polite company, as Dad had predicted. Melissa's smile became slightly strained, and she quickly excused herself to go check on how things were progressing with the main course. Dad and I exchanged glances that suggested we were both beginning to have similar concerns about how the evening was going to unfold. Mom continued eating the antipasto with determined politeness, though I could see her making the same face she made when she was trying to hide her reaction to something that didn't taste quite right. "So, how's work been?" Dad asked me, clearly, trying to steer the conversation away from the kitchen sounds and toward safer territory. I was about to answer when Kevin appeared in the doorway, still wearing his flour-covered apron and looking slightly frazzled. His face was flushed, and there were what appeared to be sauce stains on his shirt in addition to the flour handprints. "Small delay with the pasta," he announced with forced cheerfulness. "Had to start a new batch because the first one got a little overworked. But that's the thing about fresh pasta. It's temperamental but worth the extra effort when you get it right." "Take your time," I said, though privately I was beginning to wonder if we'd be eating dinner at all, let alone at the 7:30 time Kevin had originally planned. "Actually, could I get everyone's help with something?" Kevin asked. "I need to run out quickly to grab one more ingredient I forgot. Would you mind keeping an eye on things in the kitchen while I'm gone? Just make sure nothing burns." This request struck me as odd for several reasons. First, any chef worth their salt would have all their ingredients prepared well in advance of cooking, especially for a meal they'd been planning for weeks. Second, leaving guests to monitor your cooking while you went shopping was not something a confident cook would typically do. Third, Kevin had spent the afternoon assuring everyone that everything was under control and proceeding according to plan. "What ingredient?" Melissa asked, looking as confused as I felt. "Just some fresh herbs," Kevin said vaguely. "The ones I had went bad faster than expected. I'll be back in 20 minutes, tops." He disappeared before anyone could ask follow-up questions, leaving the four of us sitting in the living room listening to whatever was happening in the kitchen. The sounds were not reassuring. There was a persistent sizzling that suggested something was cooking at too high a temperature, and occasional pops and crackles that made me think of grease spattering out of control. "Should one of us go check on things?" Mom asked after a few minutes of increasingly concerning noises. "I'll go," I volunteered, partly because I was curious about what Kevin was actually preparing, and partly because someone needed to make sure he wasn't burning down Melissa's kitchen. What I found, when I walked into the kitchen, was far worse than anything I'd been imagining, based on the sounds we'd been hearing from the living room. The scene looked like a culinary disaster zone, with every available surface covered in dirty dishes, spilled ingredients, and what appeared to be the remnants of several failed cooking attempts. The stove had 4 burners going at once, each with a different pot or pan in various stages of what might generously be called cooking. One pan contained what I assumed was supposed to be the chicken for the chicken parmesan, but the pieces looked oddly gray and were sitting in a pool of oil that was clearly too hot, based on the aggressive bubbling and popping sounds it was making. Another pot held what appeared to be pasta water, though it was boiling so vigorously that it was splashing over the sides and creating a sticky mess on the stovetop. A third pan contained what might have been intended as marinara sauce, but it had an alarming orange color and a consistency that suggested it had been cooking for either too long or at too high a temperature. The fourth burner held a small saucepan that seemed to contain butter or oil that was actually smoking, filling the kitchen with an acrid smell that made my eyes water slightly. This explained the persistent sizzling sounds we'd been hearing, from the living room, and also suggested that Kevin had left the kitchen with several things cooking that required immediate attention. I quickly turned off the burner under the smoking saucepan and reduced the heat under the other three, though I wasn't sure if my intervention was going to salvage anything that was already in progress. The chicken in particular looked beyond redemption, with a color and texture that suggested it had been cooking improperly for quite some time. The counters were covered with evidence of Kevin's preparation methods, and what I saw there was even more concerning than the chaos on the stove. There were 2 packages of chicken on the counter, both of which had expiration dates that were several days in the past. One package was partially opened and appeared to have been sitting out at room temperature for an unknown amount of time, based on the slightly slimy appearance of the meat and the unpleasant smell that was noticeable even over the other cooking. Odors. Next to the chicken packages was a cutting board that had obviously been used to prepare the meat, but it appeared that Kevin had also used the same board to slice vegetables without cleaning it in between. There were pieces of what looked like onion and tomato scattered around the edges of the board, mixed with what appeared to be raw chicken juices in a combination that was a textbook example of cross-contamination. The sink was filled with dirty dishes and utensils, some of which appeared to have been used for multiple purposes without proper washing. I could see a wooden spoon that had obviously been used to stir the orange sauce, but it also had what looked like raw chicken residue on the handle, suggesting that Kevin had used the same utensil for multiple tasks without cleaning it between uses. Perhaps most alarming was the collection of ingredients scattered around the counter that seemed to tell the story of Kevin's actual preparation methods. Instead of the high-quality Italian imports he'd been describing, I could see empty containers from generic grocery store brands. The San Marzano tomatoes appeared to have come from a regular can of Hunt's sauce. The imported cheese was clearly from a plastic container of pre-grated Parmesan. The fresh herbs Kevin had claimed to be using were obviously from those little plastic packages you find in the produce section, and several of them were brown around the edges with the unmistakable look of vegetables that had been sitting around too long. I stood in the middle of this culinary crime scene, trying to process what I was seeing and what it meant for the safety of the meal Kevin was attempting to prepare. This wasn't just a case of an inexperienced cook getting in over his head with an ambitious menu. This was a demonstration of dangerous food handling practices that could seriously hurt people. The chicken that was currently cooking had obviously been stored improperly and was past its expiration date. The cross-contamination between raw meat and vegetables meant that anything Kevin served could potentially contain harmful bacteria. The fact that he'd left multiple things cooking unattended while he went shopping suggested that he had no real understanding of proper cooking techniques or timing. I realized that I was facing a decision that would affect not just the evening's dinner plans, but potentially my relationship with my sister and the rest of my family. I could try to quietly fix what I could and hope for the best. I could find a way to subtly suggest that we order takeout instead, or I could confront the situation directly and risk creating a scene that would ruin the evening and probably damage relationships. Before I could decide on a course of action, I heard the front door open and Kevin's voice calling out that he was back. In a few minutes, he'd be returning to the kitchen expecting to continue his meal preparation as if nothing was wrong. I had maybe 60 seconds to figure out how to handle a situation that had already gone far beyond anything I'd been prepared to deal with. The smell from the smoking oil was getting stronger, despite my having turned off the burner, and I could hear my family in the living room starting to comment on the increasingly obvious signs that something was not going according to plan in the kitchen. Whatever I decided to do, I was going to have to do it quickly, before Kevin returned and before the situation deteriorated even further. As I stood there surrounded by the evidence of Kevin's dangerous cooking methods, I realized that this moment was going to define not just how the evening unfolded, but how I chose to handle situations where being polite might mean putting people I cared about at risk. The responsible thing to do was clear, even if it wasn't going to be easy or comfortable for anyone involved. Kevin burst through the kitchen door with a plastic bag from what appeared to be a convenience store rather than any kind of specialty market where someone might actually purchase fresh herbs. His face was flushed and he was slightly out of breath, as if he'd been hurrying to get back before anyone noticed how long he'd been gone. "Sorry about that," he said, pulling what looked like a package of dried oregano from the bag. The market was busier than I expected. I watched him take in the scene in his kitchen, noting how his expression shifted from confident enthusiasm to barely concealed panic as he realized that I'd obviously been observing his cooking setup. The smoking saucepan was now sitting on a cold burner. The chicken had stopped its aggressive bubbling, and the overall chaos was more apparent now that the immediate crisis had been temporarily addressed. "Did you turn down the heat?" he asked, trying to sound casual but with an edge in his voice that suggested he was concerned about what I might have seen. "The oil was smoking pretty badly," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I was worried it might set off the smoke alarm." Kevin moved quickly to the stove, checking each of the pots and pans as if he was assessing damage rather than continuing his cooking process. He picked up a wooden spoon that I'd seen him use for multiple purposes and gave the orange sauce a tentative stir, causing it to release a smell that was definitely not what marinara sauce should smell like. "Everything's under control," he said, though he was speaking more to himself than to me. "Just need to adjust a few things and we'll be ready to serve." I watched him open the package of dried oregano and sprinkle it directly into the questionable sauce without tasting it first, or considering whether the flavors would work together. This was not the behavior of someone who understood cooking as anything more than a random combination of ingredients heated together and hoped for the best. "Kevin," I said carefully, "I noticed the chicken packages on the counter have expiration dates from several days ago." He froze for a moment, then turned to face me with a smile that looked forced and uncomfortable. "Oh, that's nothing to worry about. Those dates are really conservative. Chicken is fine for several days past the printed date as long as it's been stored properly." This was categorically untrue, and we both knew it. Poultry expiration dates exist for important safety reasons, and eating chicken that's several days past its expiration date is one of the most reliable ways to get serious food poisoning. The fact that Kevin was not only willing to serve expired meat to our family, but was actively defending the practice, confirmed that he had no real understanding of basic food safety principles. "Are you sure about that?" I asked. "Because the chicken in that opened package looks like it might have been sitting out for a while." Kevin's expression shifted from forced cheerfulness to something more defensive. "Look, Rachel, I appreciate your concern, but I've been cooking for years. I know what I'm doing. Sometimes people get too hung up on arbitrary dates instead of trusting their experience and instincts." The irony of Kevin talking about trusting experience and instincts was not lost on me, given that all of my research had revealed he had no relevant experience to trust. But more concerning was the fact that he was now actively arguing in favor of serving potentially dangerous food, rather than acknowledging that there might be a problem with his preparation methods. "Maybe we should just order pizza instead," I suggested, trying to find a diplomatic way to avoid eating what Kevin was preparing without directly accusing him of creating a health hazard. "Pizza?" Kevin's voice went up an octave. "For your birthday dinner? After I've been working on this all day? Rachel, I promised you an authentic Italian experience, and that's what you're going to get." There was something almost desperate in his insistence, as if admitting that his cooking wasn't suitable for consumption would somehow undermine his entire identity. I was beginning to understand that Kevin's investment in being seen as a skilled chef went far beyond simple pride or enthusiasm. It seemed to be central to how he saw himself and how he wanted others to see him. From the living room, I could hear my father's voice asking Melissa if everything was all right in the kitchen, since we'd been gone for quite a while, and the smells coming from that direction were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Melissa's response was muffled, but her tone suggested she was starting to share some of Dad's concern about how the evening was progressing. "Kevin, I really think we should consider alternatives." I tried again. "Maybe we could save this meal for another time when you've had a chance to get fresher ingredients." "The ingredients are fine," he snapped, then immediately tried to soften his tone. "I mean, everything is perfectly safe and delicious. You're just going to have to trust me on this." But trust was exactly what I could no longer do. Between the expired chicken, the cross-contamination I'd observed, the lies about where he'd purchased his ingredients, and his defensive attitude about obvious safety concerns, Kevin had demonstrated that he was either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the serious problems with what he was doing. I made a decision that I knew was going to create conflict, but that seemed necessary to protect my family from potential food poisoning. "I'm going to tell everyone that we should order takeout instead," I said firmly. Kevin's face went red. "You're going to embarrass me in front of your family? On your birthday? Because you're paranoid about food safety?" "I'm going to prevent people from getting sick," I replied. "Kevin, this isn't about embarrassing you. This is about the fact that you're planning to serve expired chicken that's been improperly stored and prepared using methods that could seriously hurt people." "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice rising loud enough that I was sure everyone in the living room could hear us. "I've been cooking professionally for years. I know more about food safety than you do." This claim was so obviously false that I almost laughed, but the situation was too serious for humor. Kevin had never worked professionally in any kitchen, had no food safety training, and was currently demonstrating dangerous ignorance about basic cooking principles. Yet he was so committed to maintaining his false persona that he was willing to argue with me rather than acknowledge the obvious problems with his meal preparation. "Then show me your food safety certification," I said, calling his bluff directly. Kevin's expression went through several rapid changes as he realized he'd been caught in a lie he couldn't easily escape. "I don't need a piece of paper to prove I know what I'm doing," he said finally. "Actually, you do," I replied. "Anyone who's worked in a professional kitchen has to have food safety certification. It's not optional." Before Kevin could respond, Melissa appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking concerned and slightly embarrassed. "Is everything okay in here?" We could hear raised voices. Kevin immediately switched to damage control mode. "Everything's fine. Rachel's just being overly cautious about some minor details. Nothing to worry about." Melissa looked back and forth between us, clearly sensing that the situation was more serious than Kevin was making it sound. "What kind of details?" I faced a choice that would affect my relationship with my sister and potentially create a permanent rift in our family. I could go along with Kevin's dismissal of my concerns, allow everyone to eat potentially dangerous food and hope for the best. Or I could tell Melissa the truth about what I'd observed and risk creating a scene that would ruin the evening and possibly damage relationships permanently. "The chicken is expired," I said simply. "Several days past the expiration date, and it's been sitting out at room temperature." Melissa's face went pale. "Kevin, is that true?" "The dates are just guidelines," Kevin said quickly. "The chicken is perfectly fine. Rachel is overreacting." But Melissa was already moving toward the counter where the chicken packages were still sitting. She picked up one of them and read the expiration date, then looked at Kevin with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. "This expired 4 days ago," she said quietly. "Melissa, trust me," Kevin pleaded. "I know what I'm doing. The chicken is safe to eat." "Kevin," Melissa said slowly, "have you actually worked in restaurants? Like, professionally?" The question hung in the air between them, and I could see Kevin realizing that his carefully constructed identity was about to collapse. He'd been caught in multiple lies, confronted with evidence of dangerous food handling practices, and now his wife was questioning the fundamental claims he'd been making about his background and expertise. "Of course I have," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Where?" Melissa asked. "What restaurants?" Kevin's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. He looked like someone who'd been asked to solve a complex mathematical equation in front of an audience, knowing that everyone was about to discover he'd never actually learned mathematics. From the living room, Dad's voice called out, "Is dinner going to be ready soon? We're getting pretty hungry out here." Melissa continued staring at Kevin, waiting for an answer that we all knew wasn't coming. The silence stretched out uncomfortably, until it became clear that Kevin either couldn't or wouldn't provide the names of restaurants where he'd supposedly worked. "Kevin," Melissa said softly, "have you been lying to me about your cooking experience?" "I haven't been lying," Kevin said desperately. "I've been learning, practicing, getting better. I watch cooking shows, I study techniques online. I know what I'm doing." "Watching cooking shows is not the same as professional experience," I said, "and it's definitely not the same as understanding food safety." Melissa sat down heavily on one of the kitchen stools, looking like someone who was processing information that was fundamentally changing her understanding of her husband and their relationship. "Kevin, I've been telling people for 4 years that you're a chef. I've been bragging about your restaurant experience." "I never said I was a professional chef," Kevin protested weakly. "You absolutely did," Melissa replied, her voice getting stronger. "You told me you worked in restaurant kitchens in college. You said you learned from experienced chefs. You've been letting me believe that for our entire marriage." The conversation was interrupted by our mother appearing in the kitchen doorway, looking concerned about the obvious tension and the fact that no food was being served despite it being well past the announced dinner time. "Is everything all right?" Mom asked, taking in the scene of Melissa sitting with her head in her hands, Kevin looking panicked and defensive, and me standing next to a counter covered with expired ingredients and evidence of poor food handling practices. "We're having a small disagreement about dinner," Kevin said, trying to regain control of the situation. Mom's nose wrinkled slightly as she became more aware of the smells in the kitchen, which were definitely not the appetizing aromas you'd expect from a well-prepared Italian meal. "What's that burning smell?" I realized that in all the drama, we'd forgotten about the various pots and pans on the stove. The pasta water had boiled down to almost nothing, leaving a scorched smell in the air. The orange sauce had developed a skin on top and was beginning to stick to the bottom of the pan. Even with the heat turned down, Kevin's abandoned cooking was continuing to deteriorate. "Maybe we should just start over," Mom suggested diplomatically. "Or perhaps order something from that nice Italian restaurant we went to for your father's birthday." "No," Kevin said firmly. "I've put too much work into this meal to give up now. Everything is fixable." But as I looked around the kitchen, it was clear that nothing was fixable. The expired chicken was still expired. The cross-contamination had already occurred. The various dishes Kevin had attempted were either burned, overcooked, or sitting in conditions that made them unsafe to eat. Most importantly, Kevin was still insisting that there was nothing wrong with serving potentially dangerous food to our family. "Kevin," I said, making my voice as calm and reasonable as possible, "I understand that you've put a lot of effort into this, but the responsible thing to do is acknowledge that there are safety issues and find an alternative." "You're being ridiculous," Kevin said, but his protest sounded hollow even to him. Dad appeared behind Mom in the doorway, apparently drawn by the increasingly obvious signs that the evening was not going according to plan. "What's the situation here?" he asked in the direct way he used when he wanted clear information without diplomatic hedging. "The chicken is expired and Kevin wants to serve it anyway," I said, deciding that the time for diplomatic language had passed. Dad's expression immediately became serious. As someone who'd spent 30 years working in construction, he understood the importance of safety protocols and the dangers of cutting corners when people's well-being was at stake. "How expired?" 4 days, Melissa said quietly, still sitting on the stool and looking like she was questioning everything she thought she knew about her husband. "Kevin?" Dad said in a tone that suggested he was trying to be patient, but was rapidly running out of patience. "You can't serve expired chicken to people. That's not a matter of opinion." "Everyone's being overly cautious," Kevin said, but he was clearly outnumbered and running out of arguments. "Kevin," Mom said gently, "maybe we could just order pizza and save this meal for another time when you have fresher ingredients." "I don't want to order pizza," Kevin said, and there was something almost childlike in his insistence. This was supposed to be special. This was supposed to be Rachel's perfect birthday dinner. I felt a moment of sympathy for Kevin, understanding that his identity and self-worth seemed to be tied up in being seen as someone who could create special experiences through cooking. But that sympathy was tempered by the realization that he was willing to put our health at risk rather than admit that he'd made mistakes or that he wasn't as skilled as he'd claimed to be. "Kevin," I said, trying to be kind but firm. The thought was special. The effort was special. But the execution has some serious problems, and the right thing to do is acknowledge that and find a safe alternative. Kevin looked around at all of us standing in his kitchen, and I could see him realizing that he was completely isolated in his position. Nobody was willing to support his insistence on serving questionable food, and his lies about his background and experience were being exposed in real time. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with anger and embarrassment. "Order whatever you want. Apparently my cooking isn't good enough for this family." The statement was clearly intended to make us feel guilty for rejecting his meal, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of feeling bad about hurting Kevin's feelings, I felt relief that we'd avoided what could have been a serious health emergency, and frustration that he was still trying to manipulate the situation, rather than taking responsibility for the dangerous practices he'd been employing. Melissa stood up from the stool and walked over to where Kevin was standing by the stove. "Kevin, we need to talk," she said quietly. "Not just about tonight, but about everything. About the lies you've been telling me, about your background, about why you thought it was okay to risk making people sick." Kevin's face crumpled, and for the first time that evening, he looked genuinely remorseful rather than defensive. "I just wanted to be good at something," he said. "I wanted to be the kind of person who could create special experiences for the people I care about." "But you can't build special experiences on lies and dangerous practices," Melissa replied. "That's not how any of this works." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the exhaust fan that was still running, trying to clear the air of the various unpleasant smells that Kevin's cooking attempts had created. Everyone seemed to be processing what had just happened and what it meant for our family relationships going forward. I realized that what had started as concerns about a single meal had revealed much deeper issues about honesty, safety, and the lengths people will go to maintain false identities. Kevin's willingness to serve expired food wasn't just about one birthday dinner gone wrong. It was about a pattern of deception that had been going on for years and a fundamental disregard for the well-being of the people who trusted him. The evening was clearly not going to proceed as anyone had originally planned, but maybe that was for the best. Sometimes the most important conversations happen when carefully constructed facades finally crumble and people are forced to deal with uncomfortable truths they've been avoiding. What happened next surprised everyone, including me. Instead of continuing to argue or storm out of the kitchen in anger, Kevin sat down at the small breakfast table and put his head in his hands. The fight seemed to go out of him all at once, like a balloon that had suddenly been deflated. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the exhaust fan. "About everything. I don't know what I'm doing. I never worked in any restaurants. I've been making it all up for so long that I started believing it myself." Melissa moved closer to him, her anger shifting to something that looked more like concern mixed with disappointment. "Kevin, why would you lie about something like that? For 4 years?" Kevin lifted his head and looked around at all of us standing in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his failed meal and his failed deception. "Because when we first met, you were so impressed when I mentioned cooking. You lit up when I talked about food, and I'd never had anyone react to me like that before. So I kept talking, kept making up stories, kept pretending to be more interesting than I actually am. The admission hung in the air, and I found myself feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was angry that Kevin had been willing to risk our health to maintain his lies. Part of me was relieved that the truth was finally coming out, and part of me felt genuinely sorry for someone who had obviously been struggling with feelings of inadequacy for years. "But the kitchen equipment," Mom said gently. "All those expensive knives and pots. If you weren't really cooking—" "Credit cards," Kevin said with a bitter laugh. "I bought everything I thought a real chef would have, thinking that somehow the right equipment would make me into the person I was pretending to be. I've been drowning in debt for 2 years trying to maintain this image." Melissa sat down across from him at the table. "Kevin, I fell in love with you, not with some imaginary chef version of you. You didn't need to create this elaborate fiction." "I thought I did," Kevin replied. "I thought if you knew the real me, you'd realize you could do better. So I kept digging myself deeper, learning enough cooking terms to sound convincing, watching enough food shows to fake conversations about techniques I'd never actually used." Dad cleared his throat. "Kevin, I appreciate you being honest now, but we still need to address the fact that you were willing to serve expired food to our family. That's not just about lying. That's about putting people in danger." Kevin's face flushed again, but this time with shame rather than anger. "I know. I was so desperate to make this dinner work, to finally live up to all the things I'd been claiming I could do, that I convinced myself the chicken was fine. I kept telling myself that expiration dates were just suggestions, that I could make it work somehow." "Kevin," I said, "people can get seriously sick from eating expired poultry. Some of the bacteria that grows on bad chicken can hospitalize people, especially older adults." He looked at our parents with genuine horror. I didn't think about that. I was so focused on not admitting failure that I wasn't thinking about the consequences. Melissa reached across the table and took his hand. "Kevin, this has to stop. All of it. The lies, the pretending, the dangerous cooking experiments. If we're going to make this marriage work, it has to be based on who you actually are, not who you think I want you to be." "I don't even know who I actually am anymore," Kevin said. "I've been playing this character for so long that I'm not sure what's real about me and what's just part of the act." Mom, who had been listening to this conversation with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for serious family crises, sat down at the table with Kevin and Melissa. "Kevin, everyone has things they wish they were better at. Everyone has insecurities about whether they're interesting enough or accomplished enough. But building a relationship on lies doesn't solve those problems. It just creates bigger ones." "I know that now," Kevin said, "but I didn't know how to stop. Every time I wanted to come clean, I'd think about how disappointed everyone would be, how embarrassing it would be to admit that I'd been lying about everything." Dad joined the group at the table, leaving me standing by the counter feeling like I was witnessing something important, but also wondering what role I was supposed to play in this family therapy session that had erupted in the middle of what was supposed to be my birthday dinner. "Kevin," Dad said in his practical, problem-solving voice, "what do you actually enjoy doing? Not what you think you should enjoy or what you think would impress people, but what genuinely interests you." Kevin thought for a moment. "I like working with my hands. I'm good at fixing things, building things. I enjoy researching how things work and figuring out solutions to problems. But that always seemed so ordinary compared to being a chef." "There's nothing ordinary about being good with your hands," Dad replied. "Some of the most valuable people I know are the ones who can fix things and build things. The world needs people who can solve practical problems." Melissa squeezed Kevin's hand. "I wish you'd told me you were interested in building and fixing things. That's actually really attractive. I hate that we've lived in this house for 2 years, and I've been calling repair people for everything because I thought you were too focused on cooking to be interested in maintenance." I wanted to help with those things, Kevin admitted, but I thought it would break character. Chefs are supposed to be focused on food, not on fixing leaky faucets or installing shelving. I realized that Kevin had created a prison for himself out of his own lies, forcing himself to ignore his actual interests and abilities in order to maintain a false identity that was making him miserable and putting other people at risk. Kevin, I said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you ever made anyone sick with your cooking? Kevin's face went pale. I don't know, he said quietly. Maybe. There have been times when people seem to feel unwell after eating my food, but I always told myself it was just coincidence or that they had stomach bugs that weren't related to the meal. Like when? Melissa asked, and I could hear a new edge in her voice. Your cousin Sarah stopped coming to our dinner parties after she got sick a few times. And remember when your coworkers came over for that holiday party 2 years ago? 3 of them called in sick the next day. Melissa stared at him. Kevin, I was mortified about that. I thought it was just bad luck that people kept getting sick after our parties. I stopped inviting people over because I was embarrassed. I know, Kevin said miserably. I knew it was probably my cooking, but I couldn't admit it because that would mean admitting everything else too. The magnitude of Kevin's deception was becoming clearer, and it went far beyond just lying about his background. He had been willing to repeatedly risk people's health rather than acknowledge that he didn't know what he was doing. The pattern of illness after his dinner parties wasn't coincidence. It was the predictable result of someone with no food safety training attempting to prepare meals for groups of people. Kevin, Mom said slowly, do you understand how serious this is? You've been making people sick for years. I do understand, Kevin replied. I understand that I've been selfish and reckless and stupid. I understand that I could have seriously hurt someone, including all of you. But Dad leaned back in his chair with the expression he got when he was trying to figure out how to address a problem that was bigger and more complex than it had initially appeared. So what happens now? The question was directed at Kevin, but everyone looked at Melissa, recognizing that she was the one who would have to decide whether their marriage could survive this level of deception and the health risks Kevin had been creating. I don't know, Melissa said honestly. Kevin, I love you, but I don't know how to trust you right now. You've been lying to me about fundamental things for our entire relationship. And more than that, you've been putting people in danger and covering it up. I want to fix this, Kevin said. I want to be honest. I want to learn how to cook safely if I'm going to cook at all. I want to stop pretending to be someone I'm not. But I don't know how to prove to you that I can change. Maybe start by taking a real food safety course, I suggested. Not so you can pretend to be a chef, but so you can prepare safe meals for your family. And maybe consider seeing a counselor, Mom added. Someone who can help you figure out why you felt like you needed to create this elaborate deception and how to build genuine self-confidence instead of fake expertise. Kevin nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll take cooking classes, food safety courses, counseling, whatever Melissa thinks would help. This isn't just about taking classes, Melissa said. This is about you fundamentally changing how you relate to me and to everyone else. No more lies, no more pretending, no more putting people at risk to protect your ego. I understand, Kevin said. And I understand if you need time to think about whether you can forgive me for this. Melissa looked around the kitchen at the evidence of Kevin's disastrous cooking attempt and his years of deception. I need to think, she said finally. This is a lot to process. The conversation was interrupted by a rumbling sound from Dad's stomach that was loud enough to make everyone smile despite the serious nature of the discussion we'd been having. Well, Dad said, we still need to figure out dinner. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm getting pretty hungry. Pizza? Mom suggested. Pizza sounds perfect, I said, relieved to have a reason to shift the conversation away from the heavy emotional territory we'd been navigating. Kevin stood up from the table. "I'll order it," he said. "And I'll pay for it. It's the least I can. Do after ruining Rachel's birthday dinner." "You didn't ruin my birthday," I said, and I realized as I said it that it was true. This actually turned out to be more interesting than a normal dinner would have been. Kevin gave me a grateful look. "Thank you for speaking up about the chicken," he said. "I know it was awkward and uncomfortable, but you probably saved everyone from getting really sick." "That's what family does," I replied. "We look out for each other, even when it's not easy." While Kevin called the pizza place, the rest of us worked together to clean up the kitchen disaster. We threw away the expired chicken and the questionable sauce, washed the dishes that could be salvaged, and opened windows to air out the lingering smells from Kevin's cooking experiments. As we worked, I found myself thinking about how the evening had unfolded and what it meant for our family going forward. Kevin's deception had been serious and potentially dangerous, but his willingness to finally tell the truth and take responsibility suggested that there might be hope for him to change. Melissa was clearly hurt and angry, but she also seemed committed to working through the problem rather than simply walking away. The pizza arrived 45 minutes later, and we all gathered around the dining room table that Kevin had set earlier with his good dishes and candles. The contrast between his elaborate dinner preparations and our casual pizza boxes was almost comical. But somehow it felt more genuine than the formal meal he had been planning. "This is actually better than the chicken parmesan would have been," Dad said, taking a bite of his pepperoni slice. "Even if the chicken hadn't been expired," Mom added, "I'm not sure Kevin's cooking would have been edible." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Kevin said, but he was smiling when he said it. "Kevin," Melissa said, "I want you to know that I'm not upset about you not being a great cook. I'm upset about the lying and the dangerous food handling. If you want to learn to cook properly, that's fine. If you want to focus on other interests, that's fine too. But it has to be based on what you actually want to do, not on what you think will impress people. I think I'd like to take a basic cooking class," Kevin said. "A real one, where they teach you about food safety and proper techniques. Not so I can pretend to be a chef, but so I can make simple, safe meals without poisoning anyone." "That sounds like a good start," I said. We spent the rest of the evening talking about Kevin's actual interests and abilities, and it turned out that he was much more interesting as himself than he had been as his fictional chef persona. He told us about projects he'd been wanting to work on around the house, repairs he'd been itching to make, and ideas he'd had for building custom furniture that he'd never mentioned because he thought they weren't impressive enough. By the time we were finishing the pizza, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from crisis management to something that felt more hopeful. Kevin still had a lot of work to do to rebuild trust and change his patterns of behavior, but at least now everyone knew what they were dealing with. "Kevin," I said as we were cleaning up the pizza boxes, "I have a question for you." "Sure," he said. "When you were planning this dinner, at what point did you realize the chicken was expired?" Kevin thought for a moment. "Honestly, I think I knew from the beginning. When I bought it 3 days ago, I noticed the date but told myself it would be fine by the time I cooked it. Then, when today arrived and I realized how bad it looked and smelled, I kept telling myself I could make it work somehow." "Why didn't you just go buy fresh chicken?" "Because I'd already spent so much money on all the other ingredients, and I was too embarrassed to admit that I'd made a mistake with the shopping. It seemed easier to try to make the expired chicken work than to start over." This admission revealed something important about Kevin's thought processes and decision-making patterns. He was willing to take serious risks and make dangerous choices rather than admit mistakes or ask for help. These were patterns that went beyond cooking and would need to be addressed if he was going to build healthier relationships and make better decisions going forward. "Kevin," Melissa said, "in the future, if you're ever unsure about whether food is safe, I want you to promise me you'll throw it away and start over. I don't care how much it costs or how inconvenient it is. "I promise," Kevin said. "And I promise to stop pretending I know things I don't know. If I'm not sure about something, I'll ask for help or look it up instead of just guessing and hoping for the best." As the evening wound down and our parents prepared to drive home, I reflected on how different this birthday had been from what anyone had expected. Instead of a carefully planned dinner showcasing Kevin's supposed culinary skills, we'd ended up with pizza and a family intervention that had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths. But in many ways, it had been more meaningful than a normal birthday dinner would have been. We'd addressed serious problems that had been festering for years. Kevin had finally been honest about his struggles and limitations, and our family had demonstrated that we could handle difficult conversations and work through complex problems together. "Thank you," Kevin said to me as I was getting ready to leave. "For what?" "For not letting me poison everyone. For forcing me to be honest. For giving me a chance to stop being someone I'm not." "Just don't let it happen again," I said. "The lying or the expired chicken." "Never again," Kevin promised. 6 months later, Kevin had completed a food safety certification course and was taking weekly cooking classes at a community college. He'd also started seeing a counselor to work on his self-esteem issues and his tendency to create elaborate deceptions rather than dealing with problems directly. More importantly, he'd discovered that he genuinely enjoyed home repair and renovation work and had started a small side business helping neighbors with handyman projects. Melissa told me that he seemed happier and more confident now that he was pursuing interests that actually matched his abilities and temperament. Their marriage had survived the crisis, though it had required months of honest conversations and rebuilding trust. Melissa said that while she was still hurt by the extent of Kevin's deception, she was grateful that the truth had finally come out before someone got seriously ill from his cooking. As for me, I learned something important about the value of speaking up when you see problems, even when it's uncomfortable, and even when it means potentially damaging relationships. Sometimes being the person who asks difficult questions or raises safety concerns is more important than being polite or keeping the peace. Kevin still occasionally cooks for family gatherings, but now his meals are simple, safe, and actually edible. He's stopped trying to impress people with elaborate dishes and complex techniques he doesn't understand. Instead, he focuses on preparing food that tastes good and won't make anyone sick. It turned out that Kevin the honest handyman was much more appealing than Kevin the fictional chef had ever been. His real skills and genuine personality were more interesting than any character he could have invented, and he was much happier once he stopped trying to maintain an exhausting deception. My birthday dinner that year may not have gone according to plan, but it taught all of us valuable lessons about honesty, safety, and the importance of accepting people for who they really are rather than who they pretend to be. Sometimes the EI's most important conversations happen when carefully constructed facades finally crumble, and people are forced to deal with uncomfortable truths they've been avoiding. And sometimes the best birthday present you can get is the knowledge that your family is willing to prioritize your safety over politeness, and that the people you care about are brave enough to tell the truth when it really matters. The weeks following that disastrous birthday dinner were some of the most transformative in our family's history. What had started as my simple concern about expired chicken had unraveled years of carefully constructed lies and forced everyone to confront truths that had been hiding in plain sight. The aftermath wasn't easy for anyone, but it was necessary in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. Kevin's confession that night had been just the beginning. Over the following days, as the initial shock wore off and everyone had time to process what had really happened, more details emerged about the extent of his deception and the risks he'd been taking with our health and safety. Melissa called me 3 days after the birthday dinner, her voice shaky with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Rachel, I've been going through Kevin's computer," she said without preamble. "I found his search history and it's terrifying. He's been looking up things like, how long can chicken sit out before it goes bad? And can you cook bacteria out of expired meat for months? He knew what he was doing was dangerous, and he kept doing it anyway. The revelation that Kevin had been actively researching the safety of his questionable food handling practices while continuing to serve potentially dangerous meals to our family added a new dimension to his betrayal. It wasn't just ignorance or carelessness that had driven his behavior. It was a calculated decision to prioritize maintaining his false image over protecting the people who trusted him. "What else did you find?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Restaurant reviews," Melissa said with a bitter laugh. "Dozens of them. He's been studying how real chefs describe their techniques and ingredients, then using that language to make himself sound knowledgeable. I found folders full of screenshots from cooking shows, recipe websites, and food blogs. He's basically been plagiarizing other people's expertise and presenting it as his own experience." This discovery explained a lot about Kevin's cooking conversations over the years. His descriptions of techniques and ingredients had always sounded slightly rehearsed, like he was reciting information rather than sharing personal knowledge. Now I understood why. He had been reciting information, borrowed from sources he'd studied online in an effort to sound like someone he wasn't. "Melissa, I'm so sorry," I said. "I know this must be incredibly difficult to process. The worst part," she continued, "is that I keep thinking about all the times I defended him when people seemed unenthusiastic about his cooking. I thought they just didn't appreciate his creative approach, but they were probably trying to politely avoid eating food that might make them sick." Over the next several weeks, Melissa began reaching out to friends and family members who had attended Kevin's dinner parties over the years. The conversations were awkward and embarrassing, but they revealed a pattern that was even more troubling than we'd initially realized. Kevin hadn't just been making people mildly uncomfortable with questionable food. He had been regularly causing genuine illness. Sarah, the friend who had stopped attending their dinner parties, admitted that she'd gotten food poisoning twice after eating Kevin's cooking and had been too polite to mention it. Melissa's co-workers from the holiday party incident confirmed that they'd all suspected the food at the party had made them sick, but hadn't wanted to create workplace drama by saying anything directly. Most shocking was the revelation that Kevin's own parents had been avoiding family gatherings at his house for over a year, because they'd both gotten seriously ill after a Thanksgiving dinner he'd prepared. They'd been making excuses about scheduling conflicts rather than hurt his feelings by admitting that his cooking had sent his father to the emergency room with severe stomach problems. "My dad was in the ER for 6 hours, Melissa told me after talking to Kevin's parents. "They ran tests, gave him IV fluids, the whole thing. And Kevin's parents just never said anything because they didn't want to embarrass him." The scope of Kevin's impact on people's health was staggering. Over the course of 4 years, he had made dozens of people sick, sent at least one person to the hospital, and caused countless others to suffer through mild food poisoning that they'd politely attributed to stomach bugs or coincidence. All because he'd been too invested in maintaining his false identity to admit that he didn't know what he was doing. As these stories emerged, Kevin became increasingly withdrawn and depressed. The weight of understanding how much harm he'd caused seemed to crush whatever remained of his confidence and self-esteem. Melissa told me that he'd stopped leaving. The house, except for work, had stopped talking about food entirely and seemed to be avoiding the kitchen altogether. "I think he's afraid to even make a sandwich," she said during one of our regular check-in calls. "Yesterday, I found him eating crackers straight from the box because he didn't want to risk preparing anything that might hurt someone." While I felt sympathy for Kevin's obvious distress, I also felt that some period of reckoning was appropriate given the seriousness of what he'd done. The fact that he was finally understanding the consequences of his actions seemed like a necessary step in any genuine process of change and accountability. Melissa, meanwhile, was struggling with her own complex feelings about the situation. She was angry about being lied to for years, embarrassed about having unknowingly enabled Kevin's dangerous behavior, and worried about whether their marriage could survive such a fundamental breach of trust. But she was also genuinely concerned about Kevin's mental health and committed to finding a way forward that would allow both of them to heal and grow. I keep thinking about all the times I bragged about his cooking to people, she told me. I was so proud of being married to someone who seemed so talented and passionate. Now I feel like I was bragging about something that was actually putting people in danger. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner incident, Melissa convinced Kevin to see a counselor. The therapy sessions were difficult and often painful, but they began to reveal some of the deeper issues that had driven Kevin's elaborate deception. According to Melissa, Kevin had grown up in a family where achievement and talent were heavily emphasized, and he'd always felt like he didn't measure up to his siblings' accomplishments. His older brother is a successful lawyer, his sister is a doctor, and Kevin barely graduated from college with a degree in business that he's never really used, Melissa explained. When he met me and saw how impressed I was by the idea of dating a chef, it was probably the first time in his adult life that he felt special or interesting. This context didn't excuse Kevin's behavior, but it helped explain why he'd been so desperate to maintain his false identity even when it became dangerous. For someone who had spent years feeling ordinary and unremarkable, the experience of being admired for supposed culinary expertise had apparently been intoxicating enough to justify increasingly risky behavior. The therapy also revealed that Kevin had been struggling with anxiety and depression for years, conditions that he'd been masking through his elaborate role-playing and his focus on maintaining his chef persona. His therapist suggested that the constant stress of maintaining lies and trying to live up to claims he couldn't back up had been making his mental health issues worse, creating a cycle where he felt more and more pressure to prove himself through increasingly dangerous cooking experiments. Understanding Kevin's psychological state helped Melissa approach the situation with more compassion, but it also made clear that his recovery would require more than just cooking classes and food safety training. He needed to address the underlying insecurities and mental health issues that had driven him to create such an elaborate and dangerous deception in the first place. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own complicated feelings about the role I'd played in exposing Kevin's lies and forcing the family crisis that had followed. On one hand, I felt confident that I'd done the right thing by speaking up about the expired chicken and refusing to let politeness override safety concerns. On the other hand, I felt some guilt about the pain that my intervention had caused, particularly for Melissa and Kevin's parents, who were still processing the revelation that their son had been regularly making people sick. My mother, who had always been someone to smooth over family conflicts and encourage everyone to get along, surprised me by being completely supportive of the way I'd handled the situation. "Rachel, you probably saved someone from serious illness or worse," she told me during one of our phone conversations. Kevin's father ending up in the emergency room should have been a wake-up call for everyone, but instead, people just kept making excuses and staying quiet to avoid hurting feelings. Sometimes someone has to be willing to cause discomfort in order to prevent real harm. Dad was even more direct in his support. "In my line of work, when someone isn't following safety protocols, you shut down the job site," he said. "You don't worry about hurt feelings when people's well-being is at stake. Kevin was running an unsafe operation, and you called a stop to it. That's exactly what you should have done." Their validation helped me feel more confident about the choices I'd made, but I also recognized that the situation had taught me important lessons about the balance between family harmony and individual responsibility. I'd spent years politely eating Kevin's questionable food and making positive comments about his cooking because it seemed like the kind thing to do. I'd prioritized social comfort over my own instincts and observations, and in doing so, I'd enabled behavior that was actually harmful to people I cared about. The experience made me think differently about other situations where I might be tempted to stay quiet to avoid conflict. How many times had I noticed problems or inconsistencies but chosen not to speak up because it would be awkward or uncomfortable? How often do people collectively enable harmful behavior because individual intervention feels too difficult or risky? 4 months after the birthday dinner, Kevin completed his first food safety certification course. Melissa sent me a photo of his certificate, and she said that the process of taking the class had been both humbling and educational for him. Learning about proper food handling, temperature control, and sanitation had made him realize how many dangerous mistakes he'd been making over the years. He told me that every single thing he learned in the class was something he'd been doing wrong, Melissa reported. The instructor talked about cross-contamination, and Kevin realized he'd been using the same cutting board for raw meat and vegetables. They covered temperature danger zones, and he understood why so many people had gotten sick after eating his chicken dishes. More importantly, the class had given Kevin a framework for thinking about cooking as a skill that could be learned through proper instruction, rather than something that required innate talent or years of professional experience. For the first time, he began to see food preparation as a practical skill that anyone could master with appropriate education and practice, rather than as a mysterious art form that only special people could perform. Kevin also began working with a career counselor to explore job opportunities that would better match his actual interests and abilities. The process revealed that he'd been working in administrative roles that didn't engage his problem-solving skills or his preference for hands-on work. With encouragement from his therapist and career counselor, he began looking into trades and technical careers that would allow him to use his mechanical aptitude and his enjoyment of building and fixing things. He's excited about work for the first time in years, Melissa told me. He's been talking about maybe becoming an HVAC technician or learning electrical work, things that actually interest him instead of jobs he took just to pay the bills while he pretended to be a chef. The transformation in Kevin's attitude and behavior was gradual but genuine. As he began pursuing interests that actually matched his personality and abilities, he seemed to become more comfortable with himself and less desperate to impress people with fabricated expertise. Melissa said that their conversations had become more honest and relaxed, and that Kevin had stopped the constant name-dropping of cooking techniques and ingredients that had characterized so much of his speech for years. 6 months after the birthday dinner, Kevin surprised everyone by volunteering to help Dad with a home renovation project. Dad had been planning to hire contractors to update his kitchen, but Kevin offered to assist with the work as a way of learning construction skills and making amends for the problems he'd caused the family. "It's been really good for both of them," Mom told me. "Your father gets to teach someone who's genuinely interested in learning, and Kevin gets to work with his hands and see immediate results from his efforts. Plus, it's given them a chance to develop a real relationship instead of the awkward politeness they've had for years." The kitchen renovation project became a turning point for Kevin's relationship with our family. Instead of trying to impress everyone with fictional expertise, he was able to contribute genuine value through his willingness to learn and his natural mechanical ability. Dad reported that Kevin was a quick learner who paid attention to safety protocols and wasn't afraid to ask questions when he didn't understand something. "He's actually quite good at this kind of work," Dad said. "Much better than he ever was at cooking. He has good spatial reasoning, steady hands, and the patience to do detailed work properly. I think he's found something that actually suits him." 8 months later, Kevin enrolled in a formal apprenticeship program for electrical work. The program would take 2 years to complete, but it would provide him with a legitimate trade certification and the opportunity to build a career based on skills he actually possessed, rather than expertise he had to fake. Melissa said that watching Kevin pursue genuine education and training had been a revelation for both of them. "I finally understand what it looks like when someone is learning something they're actually suited for," she told me. He comes home from his classes excited to tell me what he learned, and it's completely different from the way he used to talk about cooking. When he talks about electrical work, it's clear that he understands what he's saying instead of just repeating things he heard somewhere else. The change in Kevin's confidence and self-esteem was remarkable. As he developed real competence in areas that matched his natural abilities, he stopped needing to compensate with elaborate stories and fictional achievements. His conversation became more genuine and less performative, and his relationships, with family members became more comfortable and authentic. 1 year after the birthday dinner disaster, Kevin cooked a meal for our family for the first time since that night. It was nothing elaborate, grilled chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables, but everything was properly prepared, safely cooked, and actually edible. More importantly, Kevin presented the meal without any of the grandiose descriptions or claims of special techniques that had characterized his previous cooking attempts. "I followed the recipe exactly," he said simply. "Checked the internal temperature with a thermometer, made sure everything was cooked through. It's not fancy, but it's safe." The meal was simple but good, and everyone ate it without any concerns about food safety or any need to make exaggerated compliments about Kevin's culinary skills. It was the first time in years that we'd all been able to enjoy a meal Kevin had prepared without anxiety or pretense. After dinner, Kevin asked to speak with me privately. We sat on Melissa's back patio while the rest of the family cleaned up the dishes, and Kevin thanked me again for speaking up about the expired chicken at my birthday dinner. "I know I said this before, but I want you to understand how grateful I am that you refused to let me serve that food," he said. "I was so desperate to prove myself that I was willing to risk making everyone sick. If you hadn't stopped me, someone could have ended up in the hospital like my dad did after that Thanksgiving dinner." "I'm glad I spoke up," I replied, "but I'm even more glad that you were able to use the situation as a starting point for real change." "The hardest part," Kevin continued, "was admitting to myself that I'd been hurting people for years. When I finally understood how many people had gotten sick because of my cooking, and how they'd all been too polite to tell me the truth, I felt like a complete failure as a human being." "But you weren't a failure," I said. "You were someone who made bad choices because you were struggling with problems you didn't know how to solve. The important thing is that you were willing to change once you understood the consequences of your actions." Kevin nodded thoughtfully. "The therapy helped me understand that I'd been so focused on trying to be impressive that I'd lost sight of just trying to be good. Good at something real, good to the people I care about, good in ways that actually matter." As we sat there talking, I reflected on how much our family had changed over the past year. Kevin's deception and the crisis it had created had forced all of us to examine our own behavior and assumptions. We'd learned to have more honest conversations, to address problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves, and to prioritize genuine safety and well-being over social comfort. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about the importance of trusting my instincts and speaking up when I noticed problems, even when doing so might create conflict or discomfort. The expired chicken incident had been a dramatic example, but I'd begun applying the same principles to other areas of my life, where I might previously have stayed quiet to avoid awkwardness. 2 years after that birthday dinner, Kevin completed his electrical apprenticeship and started working for a local contracting company. He was earning good money doing work that he genuinely enjoyed and was naturally suited for, and his confidence had grown in ways that seemed sustainable and authentic, rather than dependent on maintaining elaborate fictions. Melissa and Kevin's marriage had not only survived the crisis, but had become stronger and more honest than it had been before. They'd learned to communicate more directly about problems and expectations, and Melissa said that she felt like she was finally married to the real Kevin, rather than a character he'd been playing for her benefit. "I love him so much more now that I know who he actually is," she told me. The fake chef version was impressive in theory, but it was exhausting to live with because it wasn't real. The real Kevin is someone I can actually build a life with. Kevin still cooked occasionally, but his approach to food preparation was completely different from what it had been before. He followed recipes carefully, used proper food safety techniques, and never attempted dishes that were beyond his skill level. Most importantly, he was honest about his limitations and willing to ask for help or look things up when he wasn't sure about something. The transformation extended beyond just cooking and career choices. Kevin had become someone who was comfortable, acknowledging what he didn't know, asking questions when he needed help, and building genuine expertise through proper education and practice. The desperate need to appear knowledgeable about things he didn't understand had been replaced by a healthier approach to learning and self-improvement. Looking back on that chaotic birthday dinner, I realized that it had been one of the most important evenings in our family's history. What had seemed like a disaster at the time had actually been the catalyst for changes that had made all of our relationships more honest, more genuine, and ultimately stronger. The experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their harmful behavior, even when confronting that behavior creates immediate conflict and discomfort. By speaking up about the expired chicken, I'd forced a crisis that none of us had wanted to deal with. But that crisis had ultimately led to healing and growth that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Kevin's journey from deceptive wannabe chef to skilled electrician had been difficult and often painful, but it had resulted in a life that was more authentic, more sustainable, and more fulfilling than anything he could have achieved through continued deception. His willingness to face the truth about his behavior and make genuine changes had earned back the trust and respect of our family, and had given him the foundation for building a future based on real accomplishments rather than fictional expertise. The birthday dinner that had started with expired chicken and elaborate lies had ended up being the beginning of a new chapter for all of us, one characterized by honesty, accountability, and the kind of genuine relationships that can only exist when people are brave enough to be themselves and caring enough to tell the truth when it matters most. 3 years had passed since that memorable birthday dinner, and the ripple effects of that evening continued to shape our family in ways I never could have anticipated. What had begun as a simple concern about food safety had evolved into a fundamental transformation of how we all approached honesty, accountability, and authentic relationships. The changes went far deeper than just Kevin's personal journey, touching every aspect of our family dynamics and extending into areas of our lives that seemed completely unrelated to cooking or deception. The most unexpected development came when our cousin Danny, who had witnessed the birthday dinner confrontation, decided to apply similar principles of honest communication to his own struggling marriage. Danny had been having problems with his wife Lisa for over a year, but instead of addressing their issues directly, they had both been pretending everything was fine while growing increasingly resentful and distant from each other. Watching what happened with Kevin made me realize that Lisa and I were doing the same thing, just in a different area, Danny told me during a family barbecue at Dad's house. We were both pretending to be happy when we weren't, avoiding difficult conversations, because we thought that would preserve our relationship. But all we were really doing was building up bigger problems that would eventually explode. Danny's decision to have honest conversations with Lisa about their marriage difficulties had been difficult and painful, but it had ultimately led to couples counseling and a renewed commitment to building their relationship on genuine communication rather than polite avoidance. They had worked through issues about career expectations, financial stress, and family planning that had been festering beneath the surface for years. The weird thing is that our marriage is stronger now than it's ever been, Lisa said when I talked to her about their experience. When we were both pretending everything was perfect, we were actually growing apart because neither of us felt like we could be ourselves. Now that we can talk about problems when they come up, we actually feel like partners instead of roommates who are performing happiness for each other. The Kevin situation had also influenced how our parents approached their own relationship and communication patterns. Mom admitted that watching Kevin's deception unravel had made her reflect on areas where she and Dad had been avoiding difficult conversations or making assumptions about each other's feelings and needs. Your father and I have been married for 32 years, and we thought we knew everything about each other, Mom told me. But seeing how much Kevin had been hiding from Melissa made us realize that we might have our own blind spots or areas where we weren't being completely honest with each other. Their decision to have more intentional conversations about their relationship, their individual goals, and their plans for retirement had led to some surprising discoveries. Dad revealed that he had been feeling anxious about leaving his construction business but hadn't wanted to worry Mom by discussing his concerns. Mom admitted that she had been considering going back to school to finish her nursing degree, but had assumed Dad would think it was impractical at their age. We discovered that we'd both been making decisions based on what we thought the other person wanted, rather than just asking directly, Dad explained. It was a much smaller version of what Kevin had been doing with his cooking persona, but it was still a form of not being completely authentic with each other. Their renewed commitment to honest communication had led to concrete changes in their retirement planning and daily life. Dad had begun the process of selling his business and transitioning to part-time consulting work, while Mom had enrolled in nursing school and was on track to complete her degree within 2 years. Both of them seemed more energetic and purposeful than they had in years. The influence of that birthday dinner extended beyond immediate family members to friends and acquaintances who had heard the story. Melissa's best friend Sarah, who had been one of the people made sick by Kevin's cooking, found herself applying similar scrutiny to other areas of her life where she had been accepting things that didn't feel right. The Kevin situation made me realize that I'd been doing the same thing with my job that I'd been doing with his cooking, Sarah told me. I kept making excuses for why things felt wrong instead of trusting my instincts and addressing the problems directly. Sarah's workplace had been experiencing high turnover and low morale for months, but management kept insisting that everything was fine and that the departing employees were simply seeking better opportunities elsewhere. Instead of continuing to accept these explanations, Sarah had begun documenting specific problems and advocating for changes in workplace policies and management practices. I started speaking up in meetings when I noticed problems, instead of just complaining privately. To coworkers, she explained. It was uncomfortable at first, but it led to real improvements in how our department operates. Several of us realized that we'd been enabling poor management by staying silent about obvious issues. Sarah's advocacy had contributed to significant changes in her company's policies around workload distribution, communication protocols, and employee feedback systems. Her willingness to address problems directly rather than hoping they would resolve themselves had not only improved her own work experience, but had benefited her entire department. The story of Kevin's deception and transformation had also reached some of our extended family members through holiday gatherings and family communications. My Aunt Jennifer, Dad's sister, had been particularly struck by the way Kevin's need to appear impressive had led him to take dangerous risks. It made me think about my own son, Michael, and the pressure he puts on himself to seem successful, Jennifer told me during a phone conversation. He's been struggling with his career for years, but keeps pretending everything is going well because he doesn't want to disappoint us or admit that he needs help. Jennifer's decision to have honest conversations with Michael about his career struggles and offer support rather than judgment had led to some important revelations. Michael had been working in sales for a company he hated, staying in the position because he thought his parents expected him to maintain a certain level of income and professional status. He was miserable, but didn't want to seem like a failure by admitting that his job wasn't working out, Jennifer explained. Sound familiar? He was doing exactly what Kevin had been doing, just with career success instead of cooking expertise. With his parents' support and encouragement, Michael had begun exploring career options that better matched his interests and values. He had always been passionate about environmental conservation, but had assumed that jobs in that field wouldn't provide adequate financial security. Through career counseling and networking, he had discovered opportunities in environmental consulting that would allow him to pursue meaningful work while still earning a sustainable income. The Kevin story taught our whole family that it's better to be authentic and struggle sometimes than to maintain a false image that makes you miserable and potentially harms other people, Jennifer said. Michael is so much happier now that he's pursuing work that actually matters to him, even though it meant taking a temporary pay cut while he transitions. Meanwhile, Kevin's own journey continued to unfold in ways that demonstrated the long-term benefits of choosing authenticity over impression management. His work as an electrician had led to opportunities he never could have imagined when he was focused on maintaining his chef persona. His reputation for careful, high-quality work had resulted in referrals to increasingly complex and interesting projects. "I'm working on the electrical systems for a new community center downtown," Kevin told me with genuine enthusiasm during a family gathering. "It's challenging work that requires real skill and problem solving, and when it's finished, I'll be able to point to something concrete that I helped build. It's so much more satisfying than pretending to know about food that I was actually ruining." Kevin's success in his electrical career had also given him the confidence to pursue other interests that he had previously ignored in favor of maintaining his false chef identity. He had begun taking woodworking classes and had discovered a talent for furniture making that combined his mechanical skills with creative expression. "The difference is that now when I try something new, I'm honest about being a beginner," Kevin explained. "I ask questions. I take proper classes. I practice basic techniques before attempting advanced projects. It's amazing how much faster you can learn when you're not pretending to already know everything." Kevin's woodworking hobby had evolved into a small side business creating custom furniture pieces for friends and neighbors. Unlike his previous attempts at impressing people with fictional expertise, this work was based on genuine skills that he had developed through proper instruction and practice. The positive feedback he received felt authentic and earned, rather than based on polite responses to questionable results. Melissa's experience supporting Kevin through his transformation had influenced her own approach to personal and professional relationships. She had become more direct in her communication style and more willing to address problems when they arose, rather than hoping they would resolve themselves through time or avoidance. "Living through Kevin's deception taught me to pay attention to inconsistencies and trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right," Melissa told me. "I used to give people the benefit of the doubt even when the evidence suggested I shouldn't. Now I'm more willing to ask direct questions and expect honest answers." This change in Melissa's approach had affected her workplace relationships as well. She had begun speaking up more assertively in meetings, advocating for resources her department needed, and addressing performance issues with team members rather than working around their deficiencies. Her increased directness and authenticity had led to a promotion and recognition as someone who could be trusted to handle difficult situations effectively. "My supervisor told me that I'd become much more valuable as a team leader because people know they can count on me to address problems honestly, rather than sugarcoating issues or avoiding conflict," Melissa said. "It's ironic that dealing with Kevin's lies made me better at my job, but that's exactly what happened." The birthday dinner incident had also influenced how I approached my own romantic relationships. I had been dating someone named Marcus for several months when the Kevin situation unfolded, and watching my brother-in-law's deception made me more attentive to authenticity and honesty in my own relationship. Marcus had been presenting himself as very financially successful, always insisting on expensive restaurants and talking about investment opportunities and business ventures. But there were small inconsistencies in his stories that reminded me of the warning signs I had noticed with Kevin's cooking claims. Instead of ignoring these inconsistencies or making excuses for them, I began asking more direct questions about Marcus's work and financial situation. It became clear that he was significantly exaggerating his income and success, using credit cards to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford, and hoping to impress me with an image that wasn't sustainable. The Kevin experience taught me that relationships built on false impressions don't work long-term, I told Melissa when I explained why I had decided to end things with Marcus. I didn't want to enable someone else's deception or find myself in a situation where I was constantly questioning what was real and what was performance. Ending the relationship with Marcus had been the right decision, and it led me to be more intentional about seeking authentic connections with people who were comfortable being themselves rather than trying to impress me with fabricated achievements or lifestyle choices. 6 months later, I met David, who worked as a social worker and was refreshingly honest about both his strengths and his limitations. Our relationship developed on a foundation of genuine communication and mutual respect, rather than impression management and performance. David told me on our second date that he loved cooking but was terrible at it. I laughed when telling Melissa about our early conversations. After everything with Kevin, that kind of honest self-assessment was incredibly attractive. I knew I could trust someone who was willing to admit what he wasn't good at. David and I had been together for over a year, and our relationship continued to be characterized by the kind of honest communication that I had learned to value after witnessing the consequences of Kevin's deception. We addressed disagreements directly, shared our concerns and insecurities openly, and supported each other's authentic interests and goals rather than trying to maintain impressive facades. The long-term impact of that birthday dinner extended to how our entire family approached holiday gatherings and special occasions. We had become much more focused on genuine connection and shared experiences rather than elaborate presentations or attempts to impress each other. Kevin's cooking contributions to family meals were now simple, safe, and honestly presented. He might bring a basic salad or a store-bought dessert, acknowledging his limitations while contributing what he could without pretense or apology. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Instead of politely enduring questionable food while making forced compliments, we could all relax and enjoy meals that were prepared by people who actually knew what they were doing. "It's so much more pleasant when everyone can just be themselves," Mom observed during a recent holiday gathering. "We're not spending energy managing anyone's ego or pretending things are better than they are. We can just focus on enjoying each other's company." The emphasis on authenticity had also influenced how we handled gift-giving and celebrations. Instead of elaborate gestures or expensive presents chosen to impress, we had begun focusing on meaningful contributions that reflected genuine understanding of each other's interests and needs. For my birthday the following year, Kevin gave me a simple cutting board that he had made in his woodworking class. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it was something he had actually created himself using skills he was genuinely developing. The contrast with his previous attempts at impressive but ultimately hollow gestures was striking and deeply appreciated. "This is so much better than any elaborate dinner could have been," I told him when he presented the cutting board. "It's real, it's useful, and it represents actual effort and skill rather than pretense." The influence of Kevin's transformation had even reached his workplace relationships and his interactions with clients. His coworkers had noticed that he was more reliable and trustworthy than when he first started, and clients frequently requested him specifically for projects because they knew he would be honest about timelines, costs, and potential complications. Kevin doesn't oversell his abilities or make promises he can't keep, his supervisor told Melissa during a company social event. "When he says he can do something, we know he actually can. When he identifies potential problems, we take them seriously because he's not crying wolf or trying to cover up mistakes. That kind of reliability is rare and valuable." This professional reputation had led to opportunities for Kevin to take on supervisory responsibilities and mentor newer employees. His experience with the consequences of dishonesty and pretense had made him particularly effective at helping others develop realistic expectations and honest self-assessment skills. "I try to create an environment where people feel safe asking questions and admitting when they don't know something," Kevin explained when I asked about his mentoring approach. "I know from personal experience how dangerous it can be when people feel like they have to pretend to understand things they don't actually understand." The ripple effects of that birthday dinner continued to manifest in unexpected ways years later. Friends of friends who had heard the story began applying similar principles of honest communication to their own relationships and situations. Melissa received messages from people she barely knew, thanking her for sharing Kevin's story because it had inspired them to address their own patterns of deception or avoidance. "It's amazing how many people have similar stories," Melissa told me. "Not necessarily about cooking, but about pretending to be something they're not, or avoiding difficult conversations because they're afraid of conflict or judgment. One particularly moving message came from a woman named Janet, whose husband had been struggling with alcohol addiction while pretending that his drinking was under control. Kevin's story had inspired Janet to stop enabling her husband's deception and insist that he get professional help rather than continuing to accept his promises that he could handle the problem on his own. Reading about how Kevin's family finally stopped accepting his explanations and insisted on real change gave me the courage to do the same thing with my husband's drinking, Janet wrote. It was the hardest conversation we've ever had, but it led to him getting into treatment and our marriage actually becoming honest for the first time in years. The story had also influenced several people to reconsider their own career paths and pursue education or training in fields that actually matched their interests and abilities, rather than continuing in jobs they had chosen for reasons of prestige or family expectations. As I reflected on the long-term impact of that chaotic birthday dinner, I was struck by how a single evening had catalyzed changes that continued to reverberate through multiple relationships and situations. The decision to speak up about expired chicken had seemed like a simple matter of food safety at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of a much larger transformation in how our entire extended network approached honesty, authenticity, and genuine connection. The most profound realization was that the benefits of choosing truth over comfort extended far beyond the immediate situation where that choice was made. Kevin's willingness to finally be honest about his limitations had not only improved his own life, but had created space for other people to be more authentic in their relationships and pursuits. The courage to address one deception had inspired multiple people to examine their own patterns of avoidance and pretense. 5 years after that memorable birthday dinner, our family gatherings had become genuinely enjoyable, rather than exercises in polite endurance. Kevin's presence at these events was comfortable and natural rather than anxiety-provoking. He contributed to conversations from his actual areas of knowledge and experience, shared stories about his real work and interests, and offered help with practical problems that matched his genuine skills. I keep thinking about how miserable those family dinners used to be, Kevin told me during a recent gathering. Everyone pretending my food was good, me constantly worried about whether people were figuring out that I didn't know what I was doing. Melissa stressed about defending my cooking to people who were obviously not enjoying it. It was exhausting for everyone. But now look at us, he continued, gesturing around the room where family members were engaged in relaxed conversations about their actual lives and interests. No one's performing, no one's pretending, no one's walking on eggshells. This is what family gatherings should feel like. The transformation in our family dynamics had been so complete that it was sometimes hard to remember what the old patterns had felt like. The constant low-level anxiety about managing Kevin's ego and maintaining polite fiction had been replaced by the comfortable rhythm of genuine relationships where people could be themselves without fear of judgment or performance pressure. The birthday dinner that had started with such chaos and conflict had ultimately become one of the most significant events in our family's history. Not because of the drama or the confrontation, but because of the long-term commitment to honesty and authenticity that had grown out of that difficult evening. The courage to speak up about expired chicken had led to changes that none of us could have imagined at the time, touching every aspect of our relationships and extending far beyond our immediate family circle. Years later, when people asked me about the most important lessons I'd learned from the experience, I always returned to the fundamental principle that had driven my decision to speak up that night. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their harmful behavior, even when confronting that behavior creates immediate discomfort and conflict. The short-term pain of honest communication is almost always preferable to the long-term damage caused by polite avoidance and enabling deception. The Kevin situation had taught all of us that authentic relationships require the courage to tell the truth and the wisdom to insist on genuine safety and respect over social comfort. Those lessons had influenced not just how we interacted with each other, but how we approached every significant relationship and situation in our lives. The birthday dinner disaster had become the foundation for building stronger, more honest, and ultimately more fulfilling connections with the people we cared about most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.